hiring is the most expensive activity that any company will have to pay for. I think that's really step one, is like understanding how you're approaching the really kind of philosophical part of running and managing a project. I find it critically important to be aligned with the whole business to understand like what are our top line hiring priorities, right? I think it's important, one, to understand the skills on your team and also understanding, the matching criteria that you need to be mindful of. You'd be surprised how many, people and talent leaders and even finance leaders are set forward to running this work stream without having the top line requirements that they're working against.
Hello, Mario. Welcome to Hiring on All Cylinders. How's it going?
It's going great, Chris. Great to be here.
Awesome. So we're about to step into planning season, and I think talent leaders and generally leaders around the world are going to be thinking about what their plans look like for Q4 and 2024 regarding headcount and resource. So I thought it'd be really great to jump into this topic today with you. So you've got a broad view of how a lot of companies are doing this across the market, and some really great ideas and insights. So a good place to start would be, why should people spend a lot of time on this and a lot of energy and effort? Like, why is it so important to get right from your point of view?
Absolutely. I definitely agree that that's a good place to start, is just to kind of outline the why around why you would even approach this big project that could be complex. In some ways, it could be cumbersome depending on the resources or the knowledge around the team. So yeah, great place to start. I think as I kind of take a macro, kind of higher level view, I definitely believe that for any person in talent, whether you are a talent lead at a earlier stage company and you're kind of the one and only resource, or you're the head of talent or head of people at a larger organization, I think this practice really pulls you into kind of the broader business objectives and goals, right? I think it's an integral process to really, if not own, be a very, very active participant in. The folks that I've seen take action in that way have really changed the environment of their of their talent team and people team within their company, to be a lot more consultative and more of an advisor rather than an order taker, right? So think of kind of the inverse of like, being a participant or actively running a headcount planning process. You're basically at the liberty and mercy and waiting for the rest of the business to tell you, which direction the company is growing in. And you're kind of scrambling to understand, like, do I have the right resource to be able to match, the growth of the business, right? And you also don't have the ability to push back or offer any, insightful suggestions as the company is mapping out their growth for the upcoming year. So I'll say that is definitely a key important component that I think really shifts the mentality and the operations of somebody being a real true thought partner and advisor, versus being, very much an order taker, kind of reactive to how the business is telling you to move forward, rather than helping them form that directional path forward. Other reasons are because, hiring is the most expensive activity that any company will have to pay for, right? Salaries, equity, healthcare, benefits, all the things that come with hiring hiring one single individual, right? So think of that times, 200, 500, depending on the growth that you're going through. If you're not hiring at the right pace, the right cadence, and even just generally the right people to match the growth of your company, there's too much to risk there, right? So hiring then becomes a business critical objective for the business. And if you're not putting forward the right strategy, there is way too much at risk and too much money to burn. I think that should be important at all times, but specifically right now with regards to how the economy is performing, certainly seeing a lot more diligence around this process and this workflow.
Absolutely. And there's a magnifying glass at the moment, especially with what's happened over the last couple of years on this planning capability inside companies, because I think a lot of people feel like they've got it wrong or they've missed the mark. And like you said, I think a lot of it comes down to being this kind of order taking function versus this proactive function and business partnering function. And I definitely know that's the aspiration for a lot of people that I'm speaking to, is to get that seat at the table and become a true partner in this process. So that's awesome. I guess, let's say as a leader, you really understand the value. What's the first step? Like, how do you set this project up? You said it's a really big task. It's really complex.
Yep.
Like, how do you get started?
Yeah. Great place to kind of get into the tactical is really understanding like how are you and your team effectively set up to run a thorough and effective headcount planning process, right? And being really honest about it, right? For earlier stage companies, you may not have, all of the components that traditionally are important parts of running a headcount planning process, right? So you may be the one and only person that is on your team that oversees talent and people, right? You may be playing the part of what traditionally an HR person plays plus the talent person, right? So take inventory of the important components of everybody's role within this really important workflow. Also, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later to talk about like everybody's role and kind of the participants of this project and what their inputs are to be able to drive a successful outcome through this project. But going back to kind of just like the planning of this project, I think you have to really understand, how are you going to approach this, right? What tools and resources do you have to be able to run an effective project, right? And I think if you go into just the mindset of like, project planning 101, what is your philosophy around running a project? I personally am a big fan of the DACY model. Some people use RACY, but it's, driver, accountable, contributor, and informed. I think if you take that framework at the very kind of top basic level and apply, every individual to those categories, it's really clear what needs to get done, right? So you can use that framework in thinking about how you structure this project. Then again, what are you going to use as your source of truth to be able to track the project and the outcome of the project, right? So you may go as basic as Google Docs and Google Sheets. Your company may embrace other more advanced tools like Notion, Airtable, Coda, which I definitely think are better alternatives because they have just richer capabilities for capturing data without having to go to multiple spreadsheets, multiple Google Docs. I think that's really step one, is like understanding how you're approaching the really kind of philosophical part of running and managing a project that has this much complexity and kind of participants and moving parts.
I guess I have a few questions around how you would then manage that once everyone's locked in and has their own kind of responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess a step before that is, are there certain functions that definitely should play a key role in this? And who do you feel, Joe, should be brought into this process and have accountability in driving this forwards with you?
Yeah. Great question. So arguably everybody plays a very, very important part. But there's definitely a pronounced level of responsibility within finance to own this, right? So if you think about kind of the intentionality behind this is to understand how are we forecasting our hiring, and hiring is kind of, there's two concentrated parts to hiring as it comes to this project. One, how much are we going to hire and how much can, recruiting actually, achieve against that goal in a realistic sense, depending on the time frame that you're looking at. Typically you see these headcount planning projects measure for the next upcoming year. But for smaller organizations, you might plan for the first 6 months of the year and then revisit for the remaining half of the year. But ultimately, it's the alignment between how talent is going to produce the results and ultimately make the hires that the business needs in order to be successful. And the second, and arguably equally or a little bit more important part, is how finance is forecasting the spend associated to those hiring motions. All that to say, I think traditionally the owner of this project is finance, but I have seen it and been in organizations where people and talent own it in partnership with finance. So they're both equal owners of driving the project from kickoff to completion and maintenance, right? Like we'll talk about maintenance in a bit, but I think that's also an important component to keep top of mind, is that this isn't a set it and forget it kind of process. You certainly have to maintain it, revisit it. You may be adjusting levels, locations that will definitely affect your forecast and budget. So those two are kind of the critical components of, again, kicking off the project, seeing it to completion, and maintaining the headcount plan as the year moves along.
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com. I know there's lots of different approaches to building teams and forecasting headcount. For sales, for example, I've seen it done where there'll be a revenue target set, and then the sales leader will work backwards from that target. I've seen a process which I actually think is much better, where you look at your existing team and their activity, and then you wait until they're at capacity before adding new heads, and it's almost the other way around. So how do you typically look at things and advise companies to do? Is it this top-down approach, or is it this more kind of bottoms up approach?
Great question. So before we talk about like the kind of like tactical approach, I think you brought up a good point in talking about like doing inventory of the skills currently on your team, either high performers, middle of the road performers, or low performers, and making sure that you have a plan to effectively, get the most output of your current team. I think data around performance of your current team is really important to look at as you're starting to build ratios, right? So ratios meaning, typically organizations that have sophisticated headcount planning processes think about, how many, people do I need to balance out this high number of salespeople that we're going to hire, right? So typically you see if sales hiring is going to boost up, you also see implementation and support, and those functions need to also match that level of growth, right? On the product engineering side, typically, when you're hiring a high volume of engineers, you have to consider how many product managers you're going to need to hire to match that level of growth, right? So I think it's important, one, to understand the skills on your team, and being able to identify high performers, middle of the road performers, and low performers. Ensure that you have a plan for balancing out that component within your company, and also understanding the matching criteria that you need to be mindful of when you're growing one part of the business versus not neglecting the other in terms of how they're going to keep up. Now, with regards to what you were talking about in terms of tops down and bottoms up approaches, it might be a good idea to just kind of like let the listener know like what that even means, right? Because I think before I learned a lot about this process in my early experiences as a talent leader, I certainly had to actually learn the definitions before I actually drove the approach. So it's pretty self-explanatory, right? If you think about kind of the terms, like top down is essentially saying the executive leadership team is saying like, hey, this is our hiring goal that we're moving forward with this approach, and it's kind of cascaded down from that point on, right? I think the advantages of that are, there's kind of an efficient and focused approach to planning, right? You're kind of limiting the people involved in that decision. And, it's kind of set from the executive leadership team on down to the rest of the business, and you're kind of moving forward with that executive decision. Other parts of it that might not be the most optimal or a drawback is that you're lacking the information of the people like down into the business that actually understand, the performance and tactical movements from day to day that make, that function either successful or needs more help and therefore more people. Now, bottoms up is the approach of, going out to your functional leadership and saying, hey, sales leader, engineering leader, so on and so forth, we are approaching headcount planning. The responsibility is on you to be able to draft up a certain hiring plan for this next upcoming year. This is the top line goal that you need to kind of work towards. and your responsibility is to drop a hiring plan for executive leadership team to look at and move forward with, right? Um, I think one advantage of that is that they're the people, really close to those departments and know how they tick and operate, through and through, and they should have, very meaningful inputs to be able to say, hey, my team needs to grow by X and this is why. Um, the downfall to that is and that I've seen personally is that these functional leaders could just kind of like shoot for the moon, right? And they're asking for more help because that's typically how people manage requests, right? You'll ask for more and assume it's going to get trimmed down. So as long as there's that kind of expectation set to say, hey, this is going to be a cycle, right? So the first request is probably not going to be the final request. So, be mindful that like this isn't going to be like the end all be all. And that approach is fine. It just takes a little bit more time. So if you are running a bottoms up approach, I would suggest giving yourself a buffer of time so that you can go through those cycles a few times with the functional leaders to be able to determine, what is like the final ask of that department that ladders up to, the folks that are responsible for the project to kind of trim it down and condense it.
Really interesting. A thought that just came into my head when we were speaking about, how people are thinking about headcount planning and building kind of resource plans for their team. I think that I've definitely noticed over the last kind of 6 months or so, especially with what's happened, that there is more discussion around, flexible, resource. So that could be, outsourcing, certain engineering teams or administrative teams or just functions that aren't core to what you're building. How should people look at that? We've kind of slight detour, but is there a rubric you use that for companies where they should say, okay, well, maybe we should consider outsourcing or using contractors for this versus FTE?
For sure. Absolutely. Great thought that came into your mind. I'm glad that you raised it. Yes, certainly. So I can speak in general terms first. There's certainly an appetite on the market to hire nearshore and offshore, right? In places that have, rich talent pools, but also available at a more affordable cost, especially for, companies that are based in the US. So that's definitely something that I'm seeing on the market and have been seeing for quite some time, but definitely, a more popular approach given the last 12 months. Now, accordingly with that, that approach, you also have to determine, are these folks on contract? What is the specific length of contract? Are they month over month, or are they going to be on a strict 12-month contract? Are they fully embedded resources, or are we dropping them into just a certain part of the business that they just work on and focus on solely? And then once their deliverables done, they kind of drop out, right? So you typically see that within engineering, right? There's two kind of schools of thought that they're either embedded or they're just working on a certain component of the product. And once they're done with that, they zoom out, right? And you can run those two concurrently. It's just all about really what the business needs and what's going to, need to be in production and worked on, immediately. Right. So I think the rubric and how it all kind of boils down to, forming a decision is looking at kind of what the traditional route would be. And in that case, it would be somebody local, somebody that's most likely going to be an FTE, and doing a cost analysis between that traditional route versus the route of saying, hey, we're going to seek to hire candidates that are offshore or nearshore. I think important components to look at is, time zones, right? Like how much is your team set up to successfully work in a remote environment? If the answer is not well, you should definitely be nearshore versus offshore. If you're built as a remote first company, you should be able to absorb hiring people offshore. Offshore meaning outside of your time zone, just to be clear. And then, do the analysis of understanding, what's the talent availability in that market and how does it match our requirements for what we need out of these professionals, right? Because I think oftentimes people and companies get really excited about a potential cost savings, but once they drop into that market, they see that the talent availability is one, really competitive, or two, it could be really just not set up to meet your standards of what you're looking for. So that's generally how
Absolutely.
I'd recommend to think about, forming a decision there.
With that cost analysis, how deep do you see people typically go? Do they look at just okay salary versus the cost? Do they look at equity? Do they look at the cost of managing that person or exiting that person? Um, should they just consider the whole spectrum of costs?
I think considering the whole spectrum of costs is definitely the best way to
Yeah,
go, right? I think like there could be some surprises that you get out of that experience. And the last thing you want is to learn those while you're actually hiring those people in that market, right? There's certain, limitations in terms of salary requirements or even comp transparency in certain markets or even requirements for notice in other countries and other markets that if you're a small company with limited resources and people operations, you may not know until you're actually in the situation. So I would firmly recommend that you run a fully well balanced, well informed process that looks at all the components, right? So the cost savings, the compliance and regulation component, and the talent availability and the talent caliber, right? You're going to want to look at all those categories, and within those categories, there's very important subpoints. But doing a comprehensive overview of if this is actually worth it and can our business actually absorb this yet is a really worthwhile way of thinking about it, so that you're not overcommitting to this approach of hiring outside of your kind of localized geolocation.
absolutely. I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, whether it's the headcount that you need, how you think about your team sizes, offshore, onshore, it really needs to tie into the objectives of the business. Um, so, how do you make sure that everyone in the business is um, working really closely to the key objectives of the company and thinking about that when they're building forecasts and building plans for resource?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think one of the main important components to have fully determined as you're moving forward with headcount planning is understanding, the upcoming goals of the year, right? And typically that's executive leadership that's setting those goals. Revenue goals, product, delivery, right? Potentially expansion into other markets. Like, what are these top line goals and how are they communicated to the folks that are fully responsible for building this headcount plan for the business? If you don't know the requirements, how are you going to build the most comprehensive plan for the business, right? So it's kind of an obvious statement to make, but you'd be surprised how many people and talent leaders and even finance leaders are set forward to running this work stream without having the top line requirements that they're working against, right? So I think that's a really important and main call out to make, is to say you have to have that alignment with executive leadership to understand, where are we heading to in this next year, which is important. That the importance of having a seat at the table to be able to know those data points is critical. Secondly, as we're talking about the deployment of the plan and actually moving forward to hire against that plan, I find it critically important to be aligned with the whole business to understand what are our top line hiring priorities, right? Because I've seen and been part of organizations where they just throw you the book and you have this plan and you're expected to just deploy it, right? There's also other instances that I've seen where they want to front load hiring, right? The business wants to front load hiring. Do you have the right resources to be able to front load hiring? How does it make the rest of the year look in terms of hiring, right? These are important components you're going to want to consider as a talent leader, because you have this talent team that you want to keep fully utilized throughout the year, right? Or you need to take another approach of saying, hey, I'm shifting my team to be more of a fractional team, right? So we have I don't know, call it 30% of our recruiters are FTE, and the rest are fractional, coming from an RPO or contract recruiters, right? So I think all of those components are really important to balance out the needs of the business, right? It's all connected, and without that data, you're going to have a hard time kind of uncovering the dark corners. having that visibility is super important, which, in my operational mind takes me back to what I was saying at the beginning of this session was you have to have a single source of truth for this whole project, or else you're going to get, a disparate, spattering of data points, and it's going to be hard to track and manage.
Do you think, in your opinion, I think there's some art to this process and some science, and I tend to have a more idealistic view that you could maybe get to a place where you could have almost like a calculator of the overlays, the current business data. So, what hiring looks like at the moment in terms of time to hire, different geographies, skill sets,
For sure.
and then the needs of the business in terms of inputs. Like, we want to hit this revenue target, we want to do this, and then the ratios, and it's kind of almost like spits out the ideal plan. Do you think that's possible? Because surely, if it was that easy, everyone would be doing that. So, is there a reason why why this seems so hard? A lot of companies that I speak to, really struggle. They're always rushing last minute. They find it difficult to get it like locked down. What do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are ways to do this in a much more sophisticated fashion. I first want to address like the early stage company, like limited resources, limited budgets for these sophisticated tools. But typically, like a lower volume of hiring at that early stage. So, the way the ability and the kind of like the reasonable expectation to do it manually is more reasonable at that size and stage. But thinking of a company that's, going from, call it 60 to 150 or 200 people in the course of a year, you're certainly going to want to take a data-driven approach that's leaning on metrics and information, right? So the first way to think about it is like, how do we actually like understand the inputs of all of this data that's flowing into this hiring plan, right? For recruiting, it's understanding, what is our typical time to hire for every one of the functional areas that we are responsible for hiring for. That should certainly influence the cadence and the flow of the hiring plan for the next upcoming year, right? So looking at your time to hire for sales, for engineering, and ensuring that those are exactly the same, right? We both know that hiring an engineer and a salesperson is a different motion. So how is that reflected in your hiring plan, and how is it, tracked and considered, as you're moving forward to hire for both functions? I think an optimistic point of view, as you said, is that we do have those tools now. I remember even just 5 years ago, those tools weren't in existence, and we were building, Excel, calculators to be able to get to that answer. Now with, thinking about ATSs and different tools that you tack onto your ATS, that can give you that sophisticated information that you can use to inform your hiring plan is a game changer, right? So, Ashby, Gem, all these other tools that have, great reporting functionalities that give you this rich data set that's an accurate depiction of how your team can perform against a goal is really game changing, like I said. Other smaller tools that I've seen on the market that help you with like a capacity plan, right? That's another thing that you would typically have to, build on our own, and still some leaders do, right? It's not the most complex thing, but if there's a tool out there that does it for you and it's a reasonable cost, why wouldn't you consider it? Growth by Design has an awesome tool called Recruiter Plan, and essentially you put in your top line goals, you apply the size of your team, you put in your time to hire within that calculator, and it tells you, based on the next 12 months, this is how your team needs to perform against the goal. And it also will tell you, based on your team size, like you're not going to meet this goal, or the inverse, right? Like your team, you have a lot of available people on your team to be able to like meet this goal, right? So you're actually going to meet your headcount goal in 8 months versus 12 months, right? So there's definitely some sophistication out there that makes the talent leader or people leader's job easier to be able to get these data points and have, a sophisticated approach as you're laddering this up to executive leadership. With regards to headcount planning, there's actually tech-enabled tools out there. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor for a company called Team Ohana, which I'm clearly a big fan of, that basically has taken on the task of digitizing this whole, spreadsheet model for headcount planning. And it fully integrates into HRIS systems, ATSs, but also, has the critical role of the HR talent leader that's running the process, plus the finance leader. And there's, full visibility into what we're all working against from a headcount plan. And in production, within a given year, you can actually change and amend the headcount plan, and it's all stored in one, clean ledger that's just completely integrated into all of your tools. There's also, companies that have moved into this product feature that traditionally were, built to be just an HRS. So one notable tool that has built a headcount planning module within their traditional HRIS function is Rippling. So there certainly are ways to start to think about, like, when you are ready to sophisticate this process, and you certainly know that you need to move away from spreadsheets or these kind of like simple kind of, typical office kind of tools, those tools are available. But I certainly would urge, everybody to be really realistic about when you need them, right? Because if you are, just growing, marginally within the year or within any increment of time, it might not be the best investment for you to run headcount planning with the help of those tools, and you could still kind of sustain, the right out or produce the right outcome with those tools like, Google Sheets, Coda, Excel, etc.
Do you think there's like a tipping point where companies should think about, going from those more primitive tools to more advanced tools? Is it like X amount of hires a year or certain velocity of hiring per month?
Yeah, I think both are kind of like interchangeable in my mind. Like if you are hiring like over 50 people and you have like a lean recruiting team, I think you should start to think about, the advantages of richer data sets and tech-enabled tools that are going to help you build a more sophisticated approach to headcount planning. Other considerations that you have to take in terms of, getting the right snapshot of what hiring is going to entail in terms of time to hire and the cost to hire is going to be, the level, right? So determining the right levels, the compensation that's associated to each level, the equity associated to each level, and the volume attached to it, right? So PAVE is a tool that most people use widely within the industry to be able to determine those factors. So yeah, I would say, if you're growing by 50 plus, you should start to consider using some sort of tool. You also are going to want to be really mindful of tool overload and tool fatigue, right? So really understand which tool is going to be the most effective and the most valuable, and what data set is most needed, and, prioritize that tool over, buying kind of the whole landscape.
And to kind of summarize and wrap this up, like if you could condense your wisdom and advice to kind of something succinct, is there like one piece of advice you'd give to talent leaders that are thinking about undertaking this process currently to do this successfully?
Yep, absolutely. I would say before you kick off or even propose more sophistication around headcount planning and headcount management, take a step back and really get clear about the why, right? Because if you don't have the why fully, confidently determined under your, leadership, like it's not going to land. Understand, a framework that you want to follow, right? Again, tops down, bottoms up, or even a blended approach to both. Understand how you're going to keep this whole project organized and how you're going to keep it clean. What's your single source of truth based on, your size, your hiring volume, and your budget. And really pull in all the right components, right? So again, top line leadership, executive leadership, partnership with finance. And, if you're a larger organization, both HR and talent having equal responsibilities to be able to build and craft the best headcount plan. I think businesses owe it to themselves to be really, really sophisticated in this function, because again, this is the most expensive action that any business takes. But also, and this is kind of like a personal opinion, is that given all the insane growth that the industry has seen in the last 5 years, we really owe it to the talent on the market to give them the confidence to know that we have a sophisticated and thoughtful approach into how we build as a company. right? Um, we all the variables that we can control to say that your job is going to be substantial here are taken into consideration. Everything else is out of our power to control, but everything that we can control, we have a sophisticated grasp on, and here's how. So I think it's important for a lot of reasons, but just really deeply understanding your philosophy, your approach, the people that are going to help you alongside your efforts in this project, and lean on your peers, right? I think there's a lot of people that really care about this right now, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon in terms of growing responsibly and sustainably. And get as many data sets as you can before you land on your approach that's appropriate for your given company.
Awesome. That's great, Mario. Super useful. And before you go, this is something I ask everyone. And like you mentioned, this industry's gone through a dramatic change, lots of innovation, getting a seat at the table for more strategic initiatives, not just kind of getting bums on seats. What are you most excited about regarding the future of TA?
Yeah, I think right now, obviously, it's a hard time to be in talent first and foremost. Unfortunately, a lot of people in talent have been laid off and are looking for work right now, so it's really tough to see, and just an overall challenge, especially for the folks that are looking for work, obviously. But I think taking an optimistic approach, I think it's a good opportunity to rethink how people and talent work together, and reimagining the roles of people in HR and people in recruiting, right? I have my own set of beliefs and kind of theories around that, and creating more longevity for the recruiter role, right? Like potentially thinking of how those people that come in to be a recruiter at a company have deeper sets of responsibilities beyond just hiring, right? And not just hiring, that's a really hard job, but thinking of the components of like potentially what an HRBP does to become kind of incorporated into the role of the recruiter. One, I think that's important again for longevity. Once hiring ticks up at every tech company, which it will, recruiters are going to be called back, and I hope that we rethink the way that their roles are structured and framed at those companies, because I think those people are going to approach every opportunity with a healthy dose of optimism or of skepticism, and want to know, like, what does my security look like at this company? The second part of why I think the roles of people and talent folks should be reimagined is obviously the AI component, right? I think the sophistication of tools that help with scheduling and sourcing, are already really strong, and I think we're definitely at the beginning of this AI component that's kind of folding into people and talent tools. And so I think ultimately that's going to decrease the actual people that we need in those functions, but the partnership is not going to go away. I think if anything, the partnership is going to intensify, and then the need to partner with your stakeholders is going to increase. The good news is that you have this really strong, rich set of data that saves you the time, and you can actually go and do some deep consultation as a business partner. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think generally speaking, and kind of just summarizing my words there, is that there's a big opportunity to think about reframing the roles within people and talent at any company, and thinking about how AI is not a replacer, but it is a sophisticated toolkit that's going to allow you to do a better job. It's going to allow you to perform better in the roles that you have.
Yeah, exciting times ahead. I'm always amazed at how fast this industry is moving, and I can't wait to see what the next kind of 5 years look like, even if they feel quite turbulent and pretty crappy for the last 12 months. I think we've definitely got some exciting things ahead. So thanks a lot for that, Mario. I think people hopefully get a lot of inspiration when they're about to kick off their own kind of headcount planning and forecasting in the next few months. Where can people find you? What you do at SignalFire? How can they see you online?
Yeah, absolutely. The best place to find me will probably be LinkedIn. Not a big X or Twitter person these days anymore, so LinkedIn is where you can find me. But yeah, I hope people also get some value out of this. If anyone listening is ever curious to pick my brain about this more, it's clearly a topic that I'm passionate about and think about a lot. So people can find me on LinkedIn to reach out to me or follow me if they care to.
Awesome. And if anyone's interested in listening to more podcasts like this, you can listen to Hiring on All Cylinders on all major podcasting platforms. Thanks a lot, Mario.
Thanks, Chris.